Hello, and welcome to the Jankiest Drift channel on YouTube. People have been asking me for a solid year at this point to share my settings for drifting with the Simagic Alpha Mini on Assetto Corsa. Transparently, it took me forever to find some settings that I liked enough to share. In addition to figuring out something that just felt good, the biggest issue I was chasing around was clipping, which is basically pausing or stuttering in the steering wheel during countersteer. But we got that sorted out, and these are my official recommended settings that I personally use for both drifting and racing on Assetto Corsa. All right, now some quick real talk. I drift both in real life and in sim. A lot of folks, myself included, find themselves on this epic quest to find the most realistic wheelbase settings. And while some settings are definitely better than others, at some point you just need to accept the hard to swallow pill that no settings are gonna be 100% true to real life. That said, these are the settings that I've found are the closest to my real life experience. Let's jump in. First, make sure that you have the most up-to-date version of Simpro and that your wheel is running the latest firmware. For that, you go to this link, which I will also put in the description, and once you've downloaded the current version of Simpro, you might get prompted to update your wheelbase firmware as well, which you should absolutely accept. Once you got that done, open up Simpro and go to the Devices tab. First setting we're going to look at is steering rotation. I personally recommend setting this to 900 degrees. Some folks do higher or lower, but most drift packs seem to default to 900 anyway, so it's a good sweet spot. Some people also run 1080 for whatever reason, but especially for drifting, once you install an angle kit in a real car, you're actually losing degrees of rotation in the steering wheel generally speaking, so over 900 to me doesn't seem to make any sense. Make sure your lock angle matches your steering angle. I think this is pretty self-explanatory, but basically if you set this to 900, your wheel will prevent you from steering any further than 900 degrees. If your degree of rotation was 900 and your lock angle was 720, basically you wouldn't be able to hit your full steering angle even if you had the wheel fully locked. So it's important that these values match. I also set my limit strength to normal, which is how hard the wheel will fight you at full lock. Force feedback, I set this to 65%, and I'll cover it a little bit more later, but I like to have feedback in Assetto Corsa set to 100%, and then I'll make any major adjustments in Simpro. Force feedback strength in general plays the largest role in whether or not you'll have clipping. This is because clipping is essentially caused by spikes in force feedback that are too high for your wheel to interpret and translate. The lower your force feedback is, the less likely you are to have clipping. That obviously can come at the cost of weaker force feedback, so the key is finding a balance. Anyway, smoothness I set to 3. You could probably go a bit higher here, but this is where I personally like it. I think if you go too high on smoothness, you lose some of that raw feedback from the road. Wheel rotation speed I set to 100%. And what I found for wheel rotation speed is that the higher you set this, the more likely you are to get clipping at higher force feedback settings. I know the interface says that this is independent from other settings, but this has not been my experience. There definitely seems to be a balance between force feedback strength and wheel rotation speed. Force feedback detail I have at 8, which is not too far from the recommended Simagic settings for Assetto Drift. And then max torque I have at 10, which I can't imagine why you would set this any lower when you can effectively make similar adjustments via force feedback strength. Mechanical damper and friction, again, not too far off from some of the recommended Simagic settings. Both of these settings in some way add weight to the steering wheel as well as resistance to the self-steer, and this is just what I've personally liked in terms of a sweet spot. Feedback frequency I set to 4, and this setting helps upscale some of the feedback coming into the wheelbase. Again, just the setting that I've played around with to find a sweet spot, and it definitely seems to help with clipping. Here's a quick look at the other effects tab, and I don't think I've made any changes to these at all. All right, jumping into content manager. On the axis tab, I've got rotation set to 900 to match the wheelbase setting, and this is kind of important, so make sure that yours match. I do have this auto adjust setting on, which helps ensure that the virtual steering wheel rotation matches the steering wheel in your hands. The main drawback to that setting being that if you're driving a car that actually has 980 degrees of rotation, for example, you'd only be able to use 900 of that based on your wheelbase settings. In that case, you can uncheck this option, which will give you that car's full rotation, but the virtual steering wheel might be a little off from yours. I think the only two places I've encountered this were running some of the regular non-drift cars in Assetto, and then running the Excite V2 pack. Most other drift packs, you should never really need to do this. Jumping into the force feedback tab, you'll see that there is an option for soft lock, which basically lets Assetto set its own steering lock points. I find that letting Simpro 100% handle locking points help decrease the issues that I was having with clipping and other weird BS, so I recommend keeping this setting off. Otherwise, on this tab, you'll see that I have my gain set to 100%, as I mentioned earlier. That's because I like to make sure that Assetto is sending the best possible signal to my wheelbase and effectively letting my wheelbase decide how much it wants to scale that feedback. I have the minimum force set to 5%, which you'll mainly notice as you're driving around slowly in the pits, and then all other effects aside from ABS are turned down to 0. I use these individual settings a bunch on my T300 setup, but once I jump to direct drive, most of them seem to be just overly violent even at low settings. Post-processing is effectively off, and these lower speed settings are set to whatever. Honestly, you're not going to be doing much low speed driving, so I don't know that these settings matter a bunch. And then all the experimental stuff is turned off. The overall theme you may have noticed is that I try to let Simpro Simpro or my wheelbase handle as much of the overall processing as possible, between force feedback strength, lock points, road effects, and so on. I have found through trial and error that this setup helps avoid a lot of the gremlins that you get when you let Assetto Corsa or Content Manager have more control over your force feedback settings. Jumping to custom shaders, force feedback tweaks. I have this active, and then the gyro setting is also active, but my understanding is that if this is set to 100%, it is effectively off and not doing anything. And then basically nothing else is applied aside from the McPherson setting, which I don't know how many car packs actually even use at this point. Okay, now here's the secret sauce. Every car pack is designed differently, and a lot of them have much higher or lower default values for their force feedback. And that's often also determined by how grippy their tires are. So what you want to do is drive a car for a lap or two, see if you're getting any stuttering or other weird behaviors, or even if the steering wheel feels ridiculously heavy. If the car feels fine, you don't have to do anything, but if it doesn't, you're gonna go to the side of the screen here, open your track apps, and find the Force Feedback Gain app. The icon or name might have changed a little bit on previous versions of Content Manager or CSP, but nonetheless, come to this top bar and see where it says 100. And we'll start by taking that down to 90. Do a lap, see how the car feels, and take it down in increments of 5 if you're still getting clipping or any other sort of weird behaviors, or even if the steering wheel is still too heavy. On the Gravy Garage cars, for example, I have this setting at 75%, N-Style I have it at 85, and there are some packs where I don't mess with this at all. So basically adjust this until you find a setting that works with the car pack you're running as well as your setup. But I'm pretty sure that covers all my settings. Hopefully all my explanations make sense. I'll flash all the setting screens one last time in case you want to pause. And this has been by far the best setup that I have found with my Alpha Mini. Honed over a full year and 100+ hours running this wheelbase at this point. And I used this non-stop last year, swapping back and forth between sim and real life events. One of my major focuses last year was improving my tandem skills, and Assetto Corsa, and specifically this setup, have been instrumental in helping me improve significantly. And whether you drift in real life or planning to drift in real life or just plan to stick with sim, hopefully this helps you too. As always, I am more than happy to answer any questions in the comments, and hopefully I'll see you next time. Thanks again for watching. Please consider commenting, liking, and subscribing, as that helps the channel probably more than you realize. If you want to help the channel more directly, maybe consider buying one of these super cool vinyls from the Janky shop. Otherwise, I guess, just watch some more videos.